You are standing on the deck of a ship in the Caribbean, sometime around 1720, and you have just made the worst career decision of your life. The sun is already brutal at 9 in the morning, beating down on a deck that smells like tar, salt, unwashed humanity, and something that died in the bilge 3 weeks ago. Your hands are bleeding from the rope work you've been doing since dawn. Your back is screaming from hauling on lines you don't understand for purposes you can't quite follow. And the man standing in front of you, Captain Calico Jack Rackham as it happens, is explaining with admirable clarity and vocabulary that would make a sailor blush exactly how your incompetence is endangering everyone on this vessel. Welcome aboard. You're a pirate now. And you're about to learn why Hollywood's version of pirate life left out about 95% of the actual experience. I know what you're thinking. Pirates, freedom, adventure, sailing the Caribbean with a cutlass and a devil-may-care attitude, dividing treasure on tropical beaches. Maybe a parrot on your shoulder if you're feeling theatrical. No bosses, no rules, no responsibilities, beyond being vaguely roguish and looking good in a bandana. Yeah, about that. Over the next 20,000 words, we're going to walk through exactly what your day would actually look like on a pirate ship in the Golden Age of Piracy, roughly 1650 to 1730, the period when Caribbean and Atlantic piracy reached its chaotic peak. We're going to discuss the food situation, which will make you reconsider every meal you've ever complained about, the disease environment, which killed more pirates than naval battles ever did, the actual work of sailing, which was brutal, technical, and unforgiving, the social dynamics, which involved more democracy than you'd expect and more violence than you'd prefer, the legal situation, which was essentially every government wants to hang you, and approximately 47 other things that would make you deeply regret your decision to seek adventure on the high seas. By the time we're done, you will never complain about your commute again, or your boss, or your performance review, or literally anything about modern employment, because whatever problems it has, it does not typically involve scurvy, keel hauling, or the very real possibility of being hanged at execution dock while crowds eat snacks and watch. So, the morning sun is climbing, the ship is moving, not smoothly, but with the constant rolling motion that's making you vaguely nauseous. Someone is shouting for you to help with the foretopsail, which you think means the sail at the front, maybe the middle one, but honestly, you're not sure. And you're about to discover that not being sure on a sailing ship is a problem with immediate, painful consequences. Let's begin. Chapter 1. How you ended up here and why it seemed like a good idea. You are sitting in a tavern in Port Royal, Jamaica, in 1720. You are, let's say, poor. Not struggling to make rent poor. Actually poor in the way that meant your options were limited, and all of them were bad. Maybe you're a sailor whose merchant ship just paid off its crew after months at sea, and the wages were terrible, and mostly eaten up by advanced debts to the ship's purser. Maybe you're an escaped indentured servant whose 7-year contract of what amounted to legal slavery finally ended, leaving you with no money, no skills, the market values, and no prospects. Maybe you're a slave who managed to escape and is now trying to survive in a world that offers very few places for someone in your situation. Or maybe you're just young, broke, and stupid, which is its own category of vulnerability. The men at the next table are talking, not quietly. They're sailors, you can tell by the way they move, by their sun-darkened skin, by their clothes and their swagger. And they're recruiting, not officially, because officially what they're doing is illegal in every jurisdiction in the Atlantic world. But they're recruiting nonetheless, because their ship needs crew. And you, drinking in this tavern with your last few coins, look like someone who needs work. They tell you about the free life, about shares of plunder instead of miserable wages, about articles, written rules agreed to by the whole crew, democratically decided, no captain's absolute authority, like on merchant and navy vessels, about the Caribbean, which they make sound like paradise, rather than the disease-ridden, hurricane-prone, politically unstable mess that it actually is. They buy you a drink. They tell you about the last prize they took, exaggerating the value by a factor of 10, and omitting the 3 weeks of boredom, and the fact that the rich merchant they captured was actually a coastal trader with a cargo of dried fish and cooking pots. And here's the thing, in your situation it sounds good. Your alternatives are: Option 1. Sign onto a merchant ship for wages that are barely survival level, under a captain who has essentially absolute authority, and who might be competent or might be a tyrant or might be both, for voyages that could last months in conditions that range from miserable to genuinely life-threatening, with no guarantee you'll be paid at the end because merchant captains were notorious for finding reasons to dock wages or declare bankruptcy. Option 2. Join the Royal Navy, where the pay is worse than merchant ships. The discipline is brutal. The officers are from a completely different social class that views you as disposable, flogging is routine, and the mortality rate from disease is genuinely horrifying. Naval ships were floating disease factories, and the pressed men, sailors forced into service against their will, died in numbers that were considered acceptable losses. Option 3. Stay in port and try to survive on whatever odd work you can find, competing with hundreds of other desperate people for jobs that don't pay enough to live on, in a town where disease, violence, and hurricanes could end your story at any moment. Or Option 4. Join the pirates, where the pay is uncertain but potentially huge, where the crew has actual rights and votes on major decisions, where there's a kind of rough equality between crew members, and where at least you'll die doing something more interesting than scraping barnacles in port for a penny a day. When you frame it like that, piracy starts looking less insane. The historical reality of pirate recruitment is that it was often semi-voluntary. Some men were forced into piracy, captured sailors given the choice between joining or being killed or marooned, but many, perhaps most, joined willingly, seeing it as the best available option in a terrible range of choices. Piracy offered something that legitimate employment in the 18th century Atlantic world often didn't. A chance, however slim, of actually getting ahead. So you agree, you drink with them. You listen to more stories, each one getting more extravagant as the night goes on, and the rum keeps flowing. Someone mentions casually that they're sailing in 2 days, and would you like to join? You say yes, because you're drunk and optimistic and desperate. They tell you to be at the dock before dawn. You shake on it. It feels like the beginning of an adventure. It is, technically, the beginning of an adventure. It's just that the adventure is going to be considerably less fun than you're currently imagining. 2 days later, before dawn, you're at the dock. The ship is smaller than you expected. Maybe 80 feet long, single-masted, or possibly a small sloop with 2 masts sitting low in the water. It's not impressive. It looks, to be perfectly honest, like a working vessel that's seen better days. The romance of the moment is somewhat diminished by the smell, which is already noticeable from the dock. You climb. Aboard, someone, you're not sure who, everyone seems to be moving with purpose while you're just trying not to be in the way, shoves a mug of something alcoholic into your hand and tells you to drink up. It's not yet 6 in the morning. You drink anyway, because refusing seems like a bad way to start your pirate career. Someone else is reading aloud from a document. These are the articles, the ship's rules, the agreement that every crew member signs or marks. You're hearing about shares of plunder, about votes for major decisions, about compensation for injuries. You'll get more money if you lose a limb in action, which seems both practical and ominous. You're hearing about rules around gambling, about how disputes are settled, about what happens if you're caught stealing from your fellow pirates. It's bad. And then you're signing, or more likely marking with an X, because literacy is not universal among 18th century sailors. You're officially a pirate now. Congratulations! Your life expectancy just dropped significantly, and you've made yourself a wanted criminal in multiple jurisdictions. The ship casts off. You're given your first task, which is something involving a rope. Everything on a ship involves ropes. You're learning this quickly. You don't know what you're doing. This is immediately obvious to everyone around you. Someone shows you, quickly and with limited patience, while the ship is already moving and the work needs to be done now, not after you've had a proper tutorial. If this is your introduction to pirate life, being thrown into technical work you're not prepared for on a moving platform, surrounded by people who need you to be competent immediately, because everyone's survival depends on the ship being sailed properly. It is not what you expected. It is not what the recruiting conversation in the tavern suggested. But you're here now. The ship is heading out to sea. Port Royal is disappearing behind you. And there's no going back, because even if you wanted to, you're now a criminal. Every government in the Atlantic world would be happy to hang you if they caught you. Your pirate adventure has begun, and you're about to learn exactly what that means. Chapter 2, The Ship. Your prison is also your workplace. You are below deck, and you're realizing that the romance of sailing kind of depends on being above deck with the wind and the sea and at least some fresh air. Below deck is different. Below deck is dark, cramped, smelly, and somehow both claustrophobic and chaotic at the same time. Let's talk about the ship you're on, because understanding the physical space you're living and working in explains a great deal about why pirate life was so difficult. Most pirate ships were not the massive three-masted galleons that movies love to show. Those ships were expensive, required huge crews, and were frankly overkill for what pirates actually did. Pirates preferred smaller, faster vessels. Sloops and schooners, mostly. Sometimes brigantines. These were ships of maybe 60 to 100 feet in length, single or double-masted, with crews of anywhere from 50 to 150 men, depending on the vessel's size and their current fortune. Why smaller ships? Speed and maneuverability. Pirates weren't trying to win pitched battles against naval vessels. They were trying to catch merchant ships that couldn't outrun them and avoid naval vessels that could destroy them. A small, fast sloop with a good crew could outsail most merchant vessels and could escape from most naval pursuers by heading into shallow waters where larger ships couldn't follow. But here's what small and fast means for the crew. Cramped conditions. A sloop with 80 crew members has maybe 60 or 70 feet of usable deck space, and a below-deck area that's even more constrained. You're living with dozens of other men in a space that wouldn't be comfortable for half that number. The deck is where the actual sailing happens, and it's a workspace crowded with equipment. Lines, hundreds of them, it seems, running everywhere, each one controlling some aspect of the sails or the rigging. Blocks and tackles for mechanical advantage when hauling. Belaying pins where lines are secured. The ship's wheel, or tiller, for steering. Cannons, usually between 4 and 12 on a pirate sloop. Small guns meant more for intimidation and warning shots than for serious naval combat. Barrels and crates lashed down wherever space allows, containing food, water, gunpowder, spare equipment. A working sailing ship's deck is not open and dramatic. It's crowded and functional and surprisingly easy to trip over if you don't know where everything is. Below deck is where things get really unpleasant. The hold, the bottom of the ship, is where cargo, ballast, and supplies are stored. It's dark, it's damp, and it smells like bilge water, which is the mixture of seawater, waste, and organic matter that collects at the lowest point of the ship and has to be pumped out regularly to prevent the ship from becoming dangerously heavy. Bilge water is one of the worst smells you'll ever encounter, and it's a constant presence below deck. The crew sleeps wherever they can find space. There are no beds, no bunks in the orderly sense. You have a hammock if you're lucky, strung up wherever there's room to hang it, which means you're sleeping inches away from other men on all sides. The hammock is actually a significant improvement over earlier sleeping arrangements. It moves with the ship rather than rolling you around, and it keeps you off the wet deck, but it's not comfortable, and privacy is completely absent. The ship is always moving, always. Even when anchored, there's the constant motion of waves. When under sail, the ship heels, tilts to one side, as the wind fills the sails. It pitches forward and back as waves pass under the hull. It rolls side to side. This constant, three-dimensional motion is disorienting at first, and never entirely stops being a low-level challenge to your sense of balance and your stomach. That brings us to seasickness. If you've never been on a boat before, you're almost certainly going to experience seasickness in your first few days. This is not a minor inconvenience. Seasickness is genuinely debilitating. Nausea, vomiting, dizziness, complete loss of appetite, and a general feeling that death would be an acceptable alternative to continuing to feel like this. And you're expected to work through it, because the ship doesn't stop needing sailors just because you're vomiting over the side. Most people adapt within a few days to a week. Your inner ear recalibrates to the constant motion. Your brain stops interpreting the movement as poisoning, and you can function again. But until that happens, you're miserable in a way that makes every other aspect of pirate life even worse. Now let's discuss the really fun part, the facilities, or rather the almost complete absence of facilities in the modern sense. The toilet, which sailors called the head, a term that's still used in nautical contexts today, was located at the bow of the ship, the very front. It was literally a plank with a hole in it, positioned over the open ocean. You sat on the plank, did your business directly into the sea, and that was that. No privacy, no shelter from weather, no dignity whatsoever. And if the seas were rough or the ship was moving fast, using the head became a genuinely precarious experience involving real risk of falling into the ocean. Some ships had a bucket below deck for nighttime use or emergencies, which created its own problems because somebody had to empty the bucket over the side in the morning, and everybody had to live with the smell of it in the meantime. Washing was limited by the availability of fresh water, which was precious and rationed carefully. You might wash your face and hands in seawater, which cleaned you superficially, but left you sticky with salt. Bathing was essentially non-existent on most voyages. You wore the same clothes day after day, week after week, and they became saturated with sweat, salt, tar, and the general grime of ship life. The smell of a pirate crew after a few weeks at sea was, by all accounts, extraordinary. You couldn't smell it yourself after a while. Your nose adapted, but anyone approaching the ship from upwind could detect it from quite a distance. The ship's structure also meant that dry was not really an option. Sea water got everywhere. Waves breaking over the deck, spray from the bow, water seeping through the planking, the constant humidity of being surrounded by ocean. Everything was damp all the time. Your clothes were damp. Your hammock was damp. Your food was damp. You learned to accept damp as the baseline state of existence. The ship was also incredibly loud. The constant creaking of wood and rigging, the sound of sails filling and flapping, the hull groaning under stress, water rushing past the planks, men shouting to be heard over all of this. Silence was not a thing that existed at sea. Even at night, when most of the crew was sleeping, the ship was never quiet. You learned to sleep through noise, or you didn't sleep much. Fire was both essential and terrifying on a wooden ship. You needed fire for cooking, for light, for heating tar for repairs. But an uncontrolled fire on a wooden vessel in the middle of the ocean was a death sentence for everyone aboard. The cook fire was carefully managed, usually in a firebox on deck, and everyone was paranoid about sparks and flames. Smoking below deck was forbidden on most ships, not as a health measure, but as a fire prevention one. The ship's maintenance was constant. Wood swells and shrinks with humidity. Ropes stretch and fray. Sails tear. Metal corrodes in salt air. Every day there was work to be done, just to keep the ship functional. Tarring ropes to preserve them, patching sails, checking and rechecking the rigging, pumping the bilge, scraping barnacles from the hull when opportunity allowed. This maintenance was not optional. A ship that wasn't maintained became unseaworthy shockingly quickly. And an unseaworthy ship in the middle of the ocean was a tomb for everyone on it. Your ship is also your only defense against the ocean, which is genuinely trying to kill you at all times. The ocean doesn't care about your situation. It will happily drown you through simple indifference. Falling overboard in open ocean was a death sentence in most cases. The ship couldn't easily stop and turn around, and a person in the water becomes invisible in the waves within seconds. Man overboard drills existed, but the success rate was not good. The claustrophobia of the ship was psychological as well as physical. You couldn't leave. You were trapped with the same 70 or 80 or 100 people, day after day, week after week, with no escape from the personalities you found irritating, the conflicts that developed, the tensions that built up when people were crowded together under stress. The ship was your entire world, and there was no getting away from it until you made port, which might be weeks away. So when pirates talk about the freedom of pirate life, they weren't talking about freedom from confined spaces, freedom from hard physical work, or freedom from discomfort. They were talking about freedom from authority, from legal employment structures that treated them as disposable, from the rigid class hierarchies of legitimate society. The ship itself was a cramped, damp, smelly, constantly moving prison that you couldn't leave, but it was a prison where you had some say in how it was run, and in the 18th century Atlantic world, that was a meaningful difference. Chapter 3. The work. It turns out sailing is hard. You are hauling on a line. Which line, you're still not entirely certain, but you're hauling on it because someone told you to, and stopping seems like a bad idea. Your hands are burning. The rope is abrading your palms in a way that will definitely be blisters by tomorrow. Your arms are shaking from the effort of pulling against what feels like the resistance of the entire ocean. And you're doing this while standing on a deck that's tilting at an angle that makes walking difficult, let alone hauling heavy loads. Welcome to the actual work of sailing, which is going to occupy most of your waking hours and is considerably more difficult than you imagined. Let's start with the basic reality. Sailing a ship in the 18th century was a highly technical, physically demanding, genuinely skilled craft that took years to learn properly. You, arriving with no experience, are at the bottom of a steep learning curve, and the ship will not wait for you to climb it at a comfortable pace. Every line on the ship has a purpose, and most lines have specific names. The halyards raise the sails. The sheets control the angle of the sails relative to the wind. The braces adjust the angle of the yards, the horizontal spars that hold the sails. The stays and shrouds support the masts. There are dozens of lines, each one critical to sail control and ship performance, and experienced sailors know all of them by name and function. You know approximately none of them. This ignorance is a problem because sailing is teamwork. When the captain or the sailing master calls for a maneuver, everyone needs to execute their part of it simultaneously and correctly. One person pulling the wrong line or failing to secure a sheet properly can result in anything from minor inefficiency to genuine danger. Sails that aren't properly controlled can tear or can create forces that damage the rigging. In extreme cases, improper sail handling can capsize the ship. Let's walk through a common maneuver, tacking, which is turning the ship through the wind to change direction. This requires coordinating the work of multiple crew members on multiple lines. The sheets on one side need to be released, while the sheets on the other side are hauled in. The helm needs to turn at the right moment. The foresails need to be backed to help push the bow through the wind. The timing matters enormously. Do things in the wrong order and the ship loses momentum and may fail to complete the turn, leaving you in irons with the bow pointing into the wind and the ship dead in the water. You don't know how to do any of this. You're learning by being shouted at and by watching others, and by making mistakes that someone else has to correct while also doing their own job. The learning process is baptism by fire, and the ship is not a forgiving classroom. The physical demands of sail handling are brutal. Sails, when wet, and they're often wet from spray and rain, are extraordinarily heavy. Hauling a wet sail up a mast requires multiple people pulling together, using block and tackle for mechanical advantage, coordinating their efforts. Lowering a sail in high winds is even harder because the wind is trying to tear the sail out of your hands while you're trying to gather and secure it. This is work that requires real strength, sustained over long periods, often while the ship is moving violently. Going aloft, climbing up into the rigging to work on sails or repair equipment was required work for most of the crew, and it was terrifying if you weren't used to it. You're climbing rope ladders that sway with every movement of the ship, getting higher and higher above a deck that's already pitching and rolling, working with cold, stiff fingers on tasks that require precision. Falling from the rigging was almost always fatal. You hit the deck or you hit the ocean, and either way, you're done. The higher you go, the more extreme the ship's motion becomes. At deck level, the ship might be pitching gently. At the top of the mast, that same motion translates into violent swinging through arcs of 10 or 15 feet. You had to work up there, hands working on rigging or sail repair, while your body was trying to compensate for motion that would make most people sick, even on solid ground. The strongest, most experienced sailors did the high-altitude work, and even they occasionally fell. You, as a new crew member, would start with deck work, and gradually, if you showed aptitude and courage, be trusted with higher work as your skills improved. The watches system meant that even when you weren't actively sailing, you weren't really resting. Ships operated on a watch schedule, typically 4 hours on duty, 4 hours off, around the clock. This meant that your sleep was constantly fragmented. You'd sleep for a few hours, wake to stand watch, work for 4 hours, then try to sleep again if you could find a spot, and could manage it despite the noise and motion. Sustained, deep, restorative sleep was not something that happened regularly on a sailing ship. The maintenance work was endless and genuinely skilled. Splicing rope, joining two pieces by carefully interweaving the strands, was a technique that took practice to do properly. A poorly done splice could fail under load, potentially with catastrophic results. Sewing sail repairs required heavy sailmaker's needles and heavy thread, working with canvas that was stiff and resistant. You were sewing with bleeding fingers, often while the ship was moving, often in poor light, always with the knowledge that shoddy work could result in a torn sail at a critical moment. Tarring the rigging, coating ropes with hot tar to preserve them from rot and salt damage, was hot, sticky, unpleasant work that had to be done regularly. You were working with tar that could burn you if you weren't careful in tropical heat, coating rope after rope after rope. The tar got on your hands, your clothes, your face. You smelled like tar for days afterward. Pumping the bilge was the work nobody wanted, but everybody had to do. The bilge pump was a manual pump that required 2 or more men working handles up and down to pump water out of the lowest part of the ship. You pumped until the bilge was clear, which could take an hour or more, depending on how much water had accumulated. It was boring, repetitive work that left your arms and back aching. The work schedule was dictated by the needs of the ship, not by anyone's preference. If a storm was coming, everyone worked to prepare. Shortening sail, securing everything on deck, battening down hatches, checking the lashings on cannons and cargo. If the ship was chasing a prize, everyone worked to squeeze maximum speed out of the vessel. If you were in combat, everyone worked their stations until the fight was over. There was no, "I'm tired and I'd like a break." There was only the work that needed doing, and the consequences if it didn't get done. And here's the part that would really get to you. You were expected to do all of this while also being constantly aware of the tactical situation. Where was the wind coming from? Were there other ships visible? What was the depth of the water? What was the weather doing? Sailing wasn't just physical labor. It was physical labor performed with constant environmental awareness, because the ocean and the wind and the weather were all factors that could kill you if you weren't paying attention. The social aspects of work added another layer of complexity. The crew had a hierarchy based on skill and experience, not official rank in the way a naval vessel did, but a genuine pecking order where the experienced sailors had authority and the new crew members, like you, were at the bottom. You took orders from basically everyone, and your mistakes reflected badly not just on you, but on whoever was supposed to be teaching you. The sailing master, the most experienced navigator and sailor, had enormous informal authority. He might not be the captain, but his expertise was what kept the ship moving efficiently and safely, and his opinions mattered to everyone. The boatswain managed the rigging and the deck work, and his say over how work was organized was law. The carpenter kept the ship watertight and structurally sound, and his skills could save everyone if the ship was damaged. The gunner managed the cannons and powder, which mattered if you were going into combat. All of these people knew more than you, had more experience than you, and had limited patience for incompetence. You were not just learning to sail. You were learning to sail while also learning the social structure, learning who to listen to, and how to avoid antagonizing people whose goodwill you needed. Getting this wrong could make your life aboard measurably worse. The work of sailing was relentless, technical, physically brutal, and socially complex. It was not the romantic adventure you might have imagined when you signed the articles. It was a skilled trade that required years to master, performed under challenging conditions, with immediate consequences for failure. And this was just the normal sailing. We haven't even gotten to the special circumstances yet. The storms, the combat, the disease, the food situation. We're still on the ordinary day at sea portion of the program, and it's already considerably worse than you expected. But the sun is setting. Your watch is ending. You're going to try to sleep in your damp hammock, surrounded by snoring men, with your bleeding hands throbbing, and your back aching, and your stomach making complaints about the food situation, which we'll discuss shortly. Tomorrow morning, you'll wake up and do it all again, and the day after that, and the day after that, for however long this voyage lasts. Welcome to Pirate Life. Hope you like rope work. Chapter 4. The Food. A study in declining expectations. You're being handed your ration for the day, and you're trying not to look too closely at it, because you're pretty sure that if you examine it carefully, you'll lose what little appetite you have left. Let's talk about food on a pirate ship, because this is where a lot of your romantic notions about sea life are going to hit a very hard, very unpleasant reality. The fundamental problem with food at sea in the 18th century was preservation. You're on a wooden ship with no refrigeration in tropical or subtropical waters, where heat accelerates spoilage, potentially weeks or months away from the last port where you took on supplies. Everything you eat has to be preserved in some way that allows it to survive these conditions, and the preservation methods available were limited, and all of them involved trade-offs. The basic staple was hardtack, also called ship's biscuit, sea biscuit, or by sailors' less printable names. Hardtack was flour and water, mixed and baked multiple times until it became a rock-hard, nearly indestructible cracker. When fresh, it was merely unpleasantly hard and bland. After a few weeks at sea, it had usually become infested with weevils, small beetles that love to bore into and lay eggs in stored grain products. You ate the weevils. This wasn't optional or a mark of desperation. It was just normal. You either ate the hardtack with the weevils in it, or you went hungry, and hunger was a worse option than a bit of extra protein from insect larvae. Some sailors would tap the hardtack on the table to make the weevils fall out before eating. Others didn't bother. After a few weeks at sea, you stopped bothering. Salted meat, usually pork or beef, was the primary protein source. The meat was packed in barrels filled with brine, and would, in theory, remain edible for months. In practice, the quality deteriorated significantly over time. Fresh salt meat was tough and salty, but recognizable as meat. Old salt meat was a gray fibrous substance. That had to be soaked in water to reduce the salt content enough to be chewable, and even then it was thoroughly unappetizing. The salt content of the preserved meat was so high that it actively dehydrated you, which created a cruel irony. Eating your rations made you thirstier, but water was rationed and had to be conserved. You learned to manage your water consumption carefully, making the most of your daily allowance, while also needing to offset the dehydrating effects of your diet. Dried peas or beans were another staple, cooked into a thick stew or porridge that was one of the few hot meals regularly available. The peas were hard, required long cooking, and provided minimal flavor but reasonable nutrition. They were one of the less objectionable parts of the shipboard diet, which tells you something about how the rest of it measured up. Water was stored in wooden casks and deteriorated rapidly. After a few weeks, The water turned green and slimy with algae growth, developed an off-smelling taste, and became increasingly unpleasant to drink. You drank it anyway, because the alternative was dehydration and death. Sometimes the water was mixed with vinegar or alcohol to make it slightly more palatable and to slow the growth of organisms in it, but this didn't solve the fundamental problem. Your drinking water was actively going bad, and there was nothing you could do about it. Beer and rum were safer than water in many cases because the alcohol content killed some of the organisms that made water dangerous. This wasn't sailors drinking for recreation, though they certainly did that too. It was sailors drinking because small beer or watered rum was literally safer than the available water supply. The daily rum ration became a celebrated tradition in sailing cultures, but it was originally a practical solution to a genuine problem. The cook's job was simultaneously crucial and impossible. He was working with limited ingredients of declining quality, trying to make something edible out of hardtack and salt meat and old peas, using a firebox on deck that was dangerous in any kind of weather, serving food to a crew that was always hungry and never satisfied. The cook was often a sailor who had been injured and could no longer do full deck duty, so being the ship's cook was often a demotion that came with a permanent injury. This didn't exactly inspire culinary excellence. The cooking equipment was minimal: a large pot for the stew, some implements for handling food, maybe a frying pan if the ship was well equipped. There was no variety in preparation methods, no seasoning beyond what salt the meat already had, no fresh herbs or vegetables after the first few days out from port. You ate the same things, prepared the same ways, day after day after day. Fresh food was a luxury that appeared only briefly after leaving port. Any fruits, vegetables, or fresh meat that came aboard would be consumed in the first few days, before spoilage made them inedible. After that, it was salt meat, hardtack, and peas for the duration of the voyage. The monotony was oppressive, the nutritional quality was poor, and the psychological effect of never eating anything pleasant was significant. The health consequences of this diet were severe, and we'll discuss them more in the next chapter. But the immediate point is that every meal was a reminder that you were living in sustained deprivation. You were always somewhat hungry. The rations were calculated to keep you alive and functional, not to satisfy you. You were always slightly thirsty because the water was rationed. You were always eating food that was barely palatable. This was every day, every single day for the entire voyage. The theft of food was one of the most serious offenses in the ship's articles, punishable severely because food scarcity made stealing from your fellow crew members a genuine harm. If someone stole your ration, you went hungry that day, and hunger on a ship where you were doing hard physical labor every day was not something you could just ignore. The psychological aspect of the food situation shouldn't be understated. Modern people are used to food being a pleasure, something to look forward to, a way to comfort yourself or celebrate or simply enjoy. On a pirate ship, food was fuel, barely adequate fuel that you forced down because you needed the calories to keep working. The loss of food as a source of pleasure was another way that ship life ground you down. Some ships, when they took prizes, would seize the cargo if it included food or drink. Captured ships carrying wine, sugar, flour, or any kind of provisions were celebrated, not for the monetary value, but for the immediate improvement to the crew's rations. A ship that captured a cargo of wine could enjoy actual pleasant drinking for a few weeks, which mattered to morale more than you might think. Fishing was possible and could supplement rations, but it wasn't reliable enough to count on. If you were in waters with abundant fish and conditions allowed for fishing, you might catch something fresh. But many pirate hunting grounds were deep ocean, where fish weren't readily accessible. And when you were actively sailing or chasing prizes, there was no time to fish, even if you wanted to. Hunting on shore, when you made port or anchored near an island, was another supplement to the diet. Turtles were particularly prized. They could be kept alive on board for days or weeks, providing genuinely fresh meat when butchered. But shore time was limited and potentially dangerous, and provisioning from hunting was more of an occasional windfall than a reliable food source. The food situation created a constant low-level misery that affected everything else. You were trying to do hard physical work while underfed. You were trying to stay healthy while nutritionally deficient. You were trying to maintain morale while eating barely palatable food day after day. It was a grind that never stopped and never improved until you made port and could resupply. The evening meal is being served. Your ration for today looks identical to your ration yesterday and will look identical to your ration tomorrow. The hardtack is crawling with weevils. The salt meat is gray and fibrous. The water tastes like the inside of a wooden barrel that's seen better days. You eat it, you drink it, because you need the calories and the hydration, and because this is what there is. Welcome to dinner on a pirate ship. Hope you weren't hungry. And we haven't even talked about the special occasions yet. The times when food ran out entirely, when the ship was becalmed, and the provisions dwindled faster than expected, when damage or storms forced longer voyages than planned. Starvation was a real possibility on long voyages, and there are documented cases of pirate crews reduced to eating leather, ship rats, and other desperations when supplies ran out. The food situation on a normal day was bad. On a bad day, it was genuinely life-threatening, but at least you're still eating. That's more than you'll be able to say for some of your fellow crew members who we'll discuss in the next chapter when we tackle the disease environment that was the single biggest killer of pirates. More dangerous than combat, more dangerous than storms, more dangerous than the Royal Navy. The food you're eating, or more specifically, what's not in the food you're eating, is setting you up for health problems that will become apparent in the weeks to come. For now, you finish your ration. Your stomach is technically full, but not satisfied. Your body is registering the food as calories, but not as nourishment. This is the baseline. This is every day. And every day you're going to wonder what you were thinking when you signed those articles and agreed to this life. The sun is set. The ship is still moving, constant and relentless. Your watch will start again in a few hours. Until then, you're going to try to sleep in your damp hammock, ignoring the sounds of dozens of other men also trying to sleep, ignoring your hunger, ignoring the aches in your body from the day's work, ignoring the taste of salt meat and weevil-infested hardtack that's still in your mouth. Tomorrow, you'll wake up and do it all again. The work, the food, the motion, the noise, the discomfort. That's pirate life. That's the adventure you signed up for. And we're just getting started on explaining why you wouldn't last. Day 2 is coming, and it's not going to be better than day 1. Chapter 5, Disease and Death. Your body is the enemy. You wake up on your 14th day at sea, and something is wrong. Your mouth feels strange. Your gums are swollen and tender when you probe them with your tongue. There's a metallic taste you can't quite place. Your legs ache in a way that's different from the usual muscle soreness from work. You're tired, but not the regular tired from poor sleep and hard labor. This is a deeper, more concerning exhaustion. Welcome to the beginning of scurvy, which is going to be your body's way of explaining that the diet we discussed in the last chapter wasn't just unpleasant, it was genuinely medically inadequate in ways that are about to become very personal. Let's talk about disease on pirate ships, because this is where the real killing happened. Combat was dramatic and gets all the attention in pirate stories, but disease killed far more pirates than cannons or cutlasses ever did. The combination of poor diet, crowded conditions, contaminated water, tropical diseases, and zero understanding of germ theory created an environment where staying healthy was less a matter of choice and more a matter of desperate luck. Scurvy is the disease that defined long sea voyages, and understanding it helps explain why extended pirate cruises were so dangerous. Scurvy is caused by vitamin C deficiency. Your body needs vitamin C to produce collagen, the protein that holds your connective tissue together. Without it, your body starts to fall apart in ways that are genuinely horrifying. The early symptoms are what you're experiencing now: fatigue, weakness, sore, and bleeding gums. Your old wounds, those blisters from rope work that cut from 2 weeks ago, start to reopen, Your teeth become loose in their sockets. Bruises appear without cause as your blood vessels become fragile and leak. Your joints swell and ache. You develop an overwhelming sense of exhaustion that makes even basic tasks feel impossible. As the deficiency progresses, the symptoms get worse, much worse. Your skin develops a rough, bumpy texture as the follicles around body hairs break down. You start bleeding from mucous membranes, your nose, your gums, even your eyes. Old, healed injuries reopen as the scar tissue breaks down without collagen to maintain it. Your bones become weak and fracture easily. In the final stages, wounds stop healing at all. Internal bleeding becomes severe, and you die, usually from cardiac failure or hemorrhage. The timeline from first symptoms to death is roughly 3 months of vitamin C deficiency, though this varies by individual. You started your voyage with whatever vitamin C you had in your system from your last fresh food. That's been depleting steadily over the past 2 weeks. By week 6 or 8 at sea, most of the crew will be showing symptoms. By week 12, people will start dying. The cruel thing about scurvy is that it's completely preventable and completely reversible. You just need fresh fruits or vegetables, or fresh meat if you're eating enough of it. Citrus fruits, fresh greens, potatoes, anything with vitamin C will stop scurvy in its tracks. But on a ship at sea for months, with no fresh provisions, scurvy was essentially inevitable. Historical accounts of long pirate voyages often mention crew members dying of scurvy, sometimes in significant numbers. The British Navy eventually figured out the lime juice solution, hence British sailors being called limeys. But that knowledge came late and wasn't universal. Most pirate crews were operating without that understanding, losing men to a disease they couldn't prevent because they didn't know what caused it. But scurvy, as bad as it was, wasn't the only killer. Let's talk about the wonderful variety of tropical diseases that were waiting to introduce themselves to you in the Caribbean. Yellow fever, called yellowjack by sailors, after the yellow quarantine flagships would fly, was one of the most feared diseases in the Caribbean. It's a viral infection transmitted by mosquitoes, and it was endemic in tropical ports. The symptoms started with fever, chills, and body aches. Then came the jaundice that gave the disease its name. Your skin and eyes turn yellow as your liver fails. Many victims would seem to recover, then relapse with severe liver and kidney failure, internal bleeding, and a mortality rate of about 50% for those who reached the second stage. There was no treatment, no prevention beyond avoiding mosquitoes, which wasn't really possible in Caribbean ports, where mosquitoes were everywhere. You either got it and survived, gaining immunity, or you got it and died. New arrivals to the Caribbean, like you, were particularly vulnerable, having no prior exposure and no immunity. Yellow fever epidemics could kill half the crew of a ship that spent time in the wrong port at the wrong time. Malaria was another mosquito-borne disease that was common in tropical regions. Unlike yellow fever, malaria wasn't usually immediately fatal, but it was debilitating and recurrent. You'd get fever, chills, sweating, headaches, and severe weakness in cycles as the parasite multiplied in your blood. The episodes would recur periodically, sometimes for years, leaving you weaker each time. A crew, with several men suffering from malaria, was a crew operating at reduced capacity, and the cumulative effect of repeated infections could eventually kill you. Dysentery, severe diarrhea with blood and mucus caused by bacterial or parasitic infection, was endemic on ships with contaminated water and poor hygiene. It caused severe dehydration, abdominal pain, fever, and could be fatal if you couldn't replace the fluids you were losing. On a ship where water was already rationed and often contaminated, dysentery was a death sentence for some, and a weeks-long ordeal of misery for everyone else who caught it. Typhoid fever, caused by salmonella bacteria in contaminated water or food, caused sustained high fever, weakness, stomach pains, and headaches. It could kill through intestinal perforation or simply through the prolonged fever overwhelming your body. Like dysentery, it spread through poor sanitation and contaminated supplies. exactly the conditions that existed on most ships. Tuberculosis, called consumption then, was a chronic bacterial infection that caused coughing, weight loss, fever, and slowly destroyed your lungs. It spread through close contact, which meant the crowded conditions on a ship were ideal for transmission. Once established in a crew, tuberculosis would slowly work its way through the men, killing some, permanently damaging others, and generally weakening everyone it touched. Pneumonia was common in sailors, whose immune systems were already compromised by poor nutrition and who were exposed to cold, wet conditions regularly. A severe chest cold could turn into pneumonia quickly, and without antibiotics, pneumonia's mortality rate was significant. You either fought it off or you didn't, and being weakened by scurvy or dysentery or malaria made fighting it off considerably harder. Skin infections were constant problems. Any cut, scratch, or abrasion, and you were getting them constantly from rope work, splinters, and general ship life, could become infected. Most infections stayed local and healed on their own if you were lucky, but some became cellulitis, spreading skin infection, or even sepsis, where the infection entered your bloodstream and killed you through systemic bacterial infection. Dental problems weren't strictly diseases, but they caused significant suffering and could be fatal. Abscessed teeth could spread infection to your jaw, and from there to your bloodstream. Severe dental pain could make eating impossible, accelerating malnutrition. And there was no dentist, no anesthesia, no antibiotics. If a tooth became bad enough, someone would try to pull it out with pliers while you were held down. The success rate was variable. The complete absence of medical understanding made everything worse. The ship's surgeon, if there was one, was usually a barber surgeon with limited training and no understanding of infection, hygiene, or disease transmission. His treatments were based on humoral theory, balancing the four humors through bloodletting, purging, and administering various substances that range from useless to actively harmful. Bloodletting, cutting a vein to release bad blood, was a common treatment for basically everything, and it made patients weaker at exactly the time they needed strength to fight disease. Purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea, dehydrated patients who were often already dehydrated. Mercury compounds, used to treat syphilis and other conditions, were genuinely toxic and caused their own set of horrible symptoms. The surgeon's best tools were amputation for severely damaged limbs to prevent gangrene from spreading, and basic wound management for injuries. For actual diseases, there was essentially nothing effective available. You got sick, and your body either fought it off or it didn't, and the treatments you received were as likely to hurt as help. The shipboard sick bay, if the ship even had one, was usually a dark corner below deck where sick men were isolated from the rest of the crew. Isolation made sense for preventing disease spread, but the conditions were often worse than the regular crew quarters. Sick men lay in the dark, on damp wood or in hammocks, receiving whatever care the surgeon could provide, which was minimal. Mortality from disease was accepted as normal. Crews expected to lose men to illness on long voyages. The pirate articles often included provisions for death. What happened to a dead man's share? Who got his possessions? This wasn't morbid pessimism. It was realistic planning for an expected outcome. Burial at sea was the standard practice when someone died. The body would be sewn into a piece of canvas, weighted with shot or stones, and slid overboard. There might be a brief ceremony if the crew liked the deceased, or if morale required it, but often it was perfunctory. Death was too common to make a major event of each one. The psychological impact of watching crew members sicken and die from diseases nobody understood and nobody could treat was significant. You could be healthy one day and dead 2 weeks later from something that came from nowhere. The randomness of it, why did this person survive yellow fever while that person died, made it clear that survival was as much luck as anything else. Your own health was a constant background concern. Every symptom, every ache, every unusual feeling could be the start of something fatal. The sore gums you noticed this morning, That's scurvy beginning. The headache you've had for 2 days could be nothing, could be the start of malaria. The cut on your hand that's red and swollen might heal fine, might become a life-threatening infection. Living with this uncertainty, this knowledge that your body was constantly under assault from diseases you didn't understand and couldn't treat, was its own form of psychological torture. Modern people take for granted that illness can be diagnosed and treated, that medicine exists and works, that the majority of diseases are survivable with proper care. On a pirate ship, none of that was true. You got sick, and you waited to see if you would live or die, and there was very little you could do to influence the outcome. The health situation also affected the ship's operational capacity. A crew weakened by scurvy couldn't work as effectively. A crew with several men down with fever had to distribute the work among fewer people. If disease hit hard enough, the ship might not have enough healthy men to sail effectively, making it vulnerable to pursuit, unable to chase prizes, and at risk from storms or navigation errors. Some pirate crews abandoned cruises early because too many men were sick to continue. Others pushed on, losing more men as they went, until the situation became desperate. The decision of when to return to port for fresh provisions and crew recovery was a balance between the opportunity cost of ending the cruise and the mortality cost of continuing with a sick crew. The disease environment of Caribbean piracy was, in short, a constant, deadly threat that killed more pirates than any other single factor. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the subject of exciting stories, but it was the reality that shaped every decision, limited every cruise, and ended more pirate careers than combat ever did. Your gums are still sore. That fatigue isn't going away, and it's only been 2 weeks. Imagine how you're going to feel at week 8. Welcome to the leading cause of death among pirates. Hope your immune system is feeling confident. Chapter 6, Violence and Combat. The part movies get wrong. You are standing on deck, and there is another ship approaching. Your captain has identified it as a potential prize. A merchant vessel, hopefully loaded with valuable cargo, hopefully not heavily armed or willing to fight. The crew is preparing for action, which means weapons are being distributed, cannons are being loaded, and everyone is taking their assigned positions for combat. You are about to discover that pirate combat is nothing like the Hollywood version, and that's mostly because real combat is significantly worse. Let's start with the goal of pirate combat, because understanding the strategy explains why the tactics were what they were. Pirates didn't want to fight. Fighting was expensive. It damaged your ship. It killed or injured your crew. It used up powder and shot that was expensive to replace, and it sometimes resulted in your target sinking with all its cargo, which defeated the entire purpose. The ideal pirate attack was one where the target surrendered immediately without a fight. This is why pirate flags, the famous Jolly Roger and its many variants, existed. The black flag was a psychological weapon, a signal that said, "We are pirates, we will take your ship. Resistance is futile and will make things worse for you." Many merchant crews, seeing a pirate flag and knowing they were outgunned and outmanned, would surrender without resistance. The pirate flag was effectively a brand, and different pirate captains had different variations. Blackbeard's flag had a skeleton holding an hourglass and a spear. Calico Jack's had a skull with crossed swords. Bartholomew Roberts had several different designs, but the message was always the same. Surrender now and you'll be robbed, but probably not killed. Resist, and we'll show no mercy. This wasn't empty threat. Pirates had a genuine reputation for violence against crews that resisted, and this reputation was carefully maintained because it made future encounters easier. If word spread that a particular pirate captain killed crews who surrendered, then future targets would fight desperately rather than give up. But if the reputation was surrender and you'll survive, fight and you'll die, then rational merchant captains would surrender, which is exactly what pirates wanted. When combat did happen, the sequence was different from what movies show. Pirates rarely engaged in the ship-to-ship boarding actions that make for dramatic film sequences. Those were high-risk operations that could go very wrong very quickly. Instead, the preferred tactic was to use the ship's cannons to disable the target from a distance, then close for boarding once the target was too damaged to resist effectively. The cannons on a pirate sloop were small, typically 4 to 12 guns, ranging from 2 to 6 pounders, referring to the weight of the cannonball they fired. These weren't ship killers. They were anti-personnel weapons and intimidation tools. The goal was to damage the target's rigging, cutting lines, bringing down sails, damaging the rudder, making it impossible for them to maneuver or escape. A ship that couldn't sail couldn't run away and couldn't fight back effectively. If the target still didn't surrender after being disabled, the next step was often to fire chain shot or grape shot at the crew. Chain shot was 2 cannonballs, connected by a chain designed to spin through the air and cut through rigging and sails. Grape shot was a canvas bag filled with small metal balls that scattered when fired, turning the cannon into a giant shotgun. Both were devastating against unprotected crew on an open deck. The actual boarding, when it happened, was chaotic and terrifying. Grappling hooks were thrown to pull the ships together. Pirates would jump or climb across to the target's deck, usually screaming and making as much noise as possible to intimidate the defenders. The fighting was close quarters. Cutlasses, pistols, boarding axes, knives, whatever weapons were at hand. Now let's talk about the weapons themselves, because they're not what you think. The cutlass, the iconic pirate sword, was not an elegant dueling weapon. It was a short, heavy, slightly curved blade designed for hacking rather than precise fencing. In the confined space of a ship's deck, you didn't have room for elaborate swordplay. You needed something that could deliver powerful, disabling blows in close quarters, ideally cutting through the heavy canvas clothing that sailors wore. Fighting with a cutlass required strength and aggression more than technique. You were trying to overwhelm your opponent with powerful strikes, aiming for arms and shoulders to disable rather than kill, because a disabled opponent was no longer a threat, but a dead opponent was just dead and not useful for anything. The cutlass was effective for this purpose, but required you to get very, very close to your opponent, which was dangerous. Pistols were single-shot, muzzle-loading flintlocks. You had one shot. After that, the pistol became a club. The loading process took at least 30 seconds under ideal conditions, which meant you absolutely weren't reloading during combat. You fired your pistol, then you switched to your blade. Some pirates carried multiple pistols for this reason. Blackbeard famously carried 6 pistols in holsters across his chest, giving him 6 shots before he had to resort to his sword. The pistols were also not particularly accurate. The smooth-bore barrels and the loose fit of the ball meant that hitting a specific target beyond about 20 feet was more luck than skill. These were close-range weapons, used at nearly point-blank range, where missing was hard. The smoke from black powder also meant that after the first volley, visibility was terrible, adding to the confusion of combat. Boarding axes and pikes were common weapons for pirates and defenders alike. The boarding axe was a brutal tool, short handle, heavy blade, designed for chopping through rigging and also for close quarters combat. A blow from a boarding axe could disable or kill, and it didn't require much skill, just the willingness to swing hard at another human being. The reality of pirate combat was that it was brief, brutal, confused, and terrifying. It was not the choreographed sword fights you see in movies. It was a chaotic melee in a confined space, with smoke and noise and blood, and men screaming, where you were trying to hurt people before they hurt you, where your footing was uncertain because the deck was moving, where you couldn't clearly see what was happening 10 feet away. Most importantly, you were trying to do all of this despite having no real combat experience. You had maybe some brawling experience from taverns or previous ships, but organized violence against people actively trying to kill you was different. The first time you actually tried to cut someone with a blade, your hands would be shaking, your breathing would be wrong, your technique would fall apart under stress. Combat stress is a real psychological phenomenon that affects even trained soldiers. Elevated heart rate, tunnel vision, loss of fine motor control, degraded decision-making. You, with minimal training, and no combat experience would experience all of this immediately and intensely. Your body's stress response would work against you, making you less effective exactly when you needed to be most effective. And then there's the aftermath. If you survived, and survival was not guaranteed, even in combats that pirates won, because accidents and wounds happened, you had to deal with what you'd done, cutting someone, hurting them, possibly killing them, while they screamed and bled. This is traumatic, even when it's justified by the circumstances. The human mind doesn't handle violence well, even in self-defense, even in cultures that normalize it more than ours does. Some pirates became hardened to combat. They fought repeatedly, developed a psychological callus that let them function in violence without falling apart. Others never adapted, carrying the trauma of combat with them, developing what we now recognize as PTSD symptoms, nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, difficulty connecting with others. But let's also discuss what happened if the combat went wrong for your side, if the target fought back effectively, if they were better armed than expected, if they received help from another ship, if luck simply went against you. Pirates could lose fights, and the consequences of losing a fight at sea were severe. Wounded pirates were treated by the ship's surgeon with the limited and largely ineffective medicine we discussed earlier. Serious wounds, deep cuts, broken bones, gunshot wounds could be fatal, even if they weren't immediately so, because infection was almost guaranteed and antibiotics didn't exist. Amputation was the standard treatment for a badly damaged limb, because gangrene would kill you if you tried to keep it. The surgery was performed without effective anesthesia, maybe rum and a leather strap to bite down on, and the survival rate was not good. If your ship was captured or sunk, the consequences were even worse. Captured pirates faced trial and almost certain execution. Piracy was a capital crime in every jurisdiction, and trials were usually short and the verdicts predetermined. The lucky ones were hanged, a relatively quick death if done correctly. The unlucky ones faced gibbeting, where your body was displayed in a cage after death as a warning to others, or in some cases were hanged in chains while still alive and left to die slowly of exposure and starvation. The violence of piracy wasn't romantic. It wasn't the exciting adventure of films. It was brutal, traumatic, life-threatening work that could leave you dead, wounded, or psychologically damaged. And the rewards for success were money you might not live long enough to spend. The ship is closing now. The other captain is deciding whether to fight or surrender. You're standing with a cutlass you barely know how to use, knowing that in the next few minutes you might have to hurt someone, that someone might hurt you, that this situation could go very wrong very quickly. This is pirate combat. This is what the movies don't show you, and you're about to find out if you can actually do it. Chapter 7. The Social Dynamics. Democracy at Sword Point. You are sitting in what passes for a crew meeting on the ship, and a vote is being taken about the next course of action. The captain has proposed heading to the Spanish Main to hunt treasure ships. Someone else has suggested staying in the Caribbean to prey on local merchant traffic. A third voice argues for returning to port because too many crew members are sick with scurvy, and the ship needs provisioning. Everyone gets a vote, including you, the newest and least experienced member of the crew. This is pirate democracy in action, and it's both more genuine and more complicated than you might expect. Let's talk about the social structure of pirate ships, because this is one area where pirate life actually was significantly different from, and in some ways better than, legitimate maritime employment. But better is relative, and the pirate version of democracy came with its own problems and dangers. The articles you signed when joining the crew weren't just symbolic. They were a genuine contract that laid out the rights and responsibilities of every crew member, including the captain. This was radical in the 18th century maritime world, where merchant and naval captains had essentially absolute authority. On a pirate ship, the captain's power was limited and conditional. The captain was elected by the crew and could be deposed by the crew if he lost their confidence. He had authority during combat and when chasing prizes, situations where quick decision-making was necessary, but major strategic decisions were voted on democratically. Where to sail, which targets to pursue, how to divide plunder, whether to accept new crew members, all of these were put to a vote. This democracy wasn't ideological, it was practical. Pirates were criminals operating outside legal authority, with no external power structure to enforce hierarchy. The only way to maintain order on a pirate ship was to ensure that the crew felt they had a stake in the enterprise and a say in decisions. A captain who made unpopular decisions could be voted out and replaced, which created a genuine check on authority. The quartermaster was in many ways more important than the captain. He was elected by the crew to represent their interests, and he had authority over the daily operations of the ship, the distribution of food and supplies, and the settlement of disputes. The quartermaster could challenge the captain's decisions, and in some cases, he effectively ran the ship with the captain serving more as a military commander during action. Plunder was divided according to shares laid out in the articles. A common arrangement was that the captain received 1.5 or 2 shares. The quartermaster and other officers received 1.25 or 1.5 shares, and regular crew members received 1 share each. This was far more equitable than merchant ships, where the captain might receive 20 times what a common sailor earned, or naval ships, where pay was determined by rank in ways that created enormous inequality. Compensation for injuries was another unique aspect of pirate articles. If you lost an eye, a hand, a leg, or suffered other disabling injuries in action, you received additional payment from the common fund. The amounts varied by injury. Losing a right arm might be worth 600 pieces of 8. Losing a finger might be worth 100. This was primitive disability insurance, providing some security to men who were injured in the crew's service. This sounds great, and in many ways it was better than the alternatives. But let's talk about the other side of pirate democracy: the violence and instability it could create. Disputes between crew members were supposed to be settled according to the articles, either by the quartermaster or by taking them to shore to settle with pistols or swords in formal duels. This kept violence from disrupting shipboard operations, but it also meant that personal conflicts could and did result in deaths. If you made an enemy among the crew, that enemy could challenge you to a duel, and refusing would mark you as a coward. The democratic structure also meant that popular leaders could be replaced if they fell out of favor, but it also meant the crew could make decisions based on greed or poor judgment. If the majority wanted to chase a target that was likely to be dangerous, you were going along even if you thought it was a bad idea. Democracy doesn't guarantee good decisions. It just distributes the decision-making power. Captain Charles Vane, a real pirate captain, was voted out of his captaincy by his crew after refusing to attack a French man of war that the crew wanted to engage. They replaced him with Calico Jack Rackham, who led them into the attack that Vane had wisely avoided. The ship was badly damaged, several crew members were killed, and they captured very little of value. Democracy had spoken, and it had chosen poorly. The social hierarchy on pirate ships was less about formal rank and more about respect, competence, and personality. The best sailors, the most successful fighters, the men who could navigate or speak multiple languages or provide valuable skills. These people had informal authority regardless of their official position. A skilled navigator was valuable enough that his opinions carried weight even if he wasn't an officer. Your position as a new, inexperienced crew member put you at the bottom of this informal hierarchy. You had a vote, yes, but your opinion didn't carry much weight. The experienced crew members made the real decisions through influence and respect, and you were expected to defer to them even in the democratic structure. There was also the question of what to do with captured crews. This was voted on, and the outcomes varied depending on the circumstances and the mood of the pirate crew. Merchant crews who surrendered without fight were usually stripped of valuables and then released with their ship, or sometimes without it, set adrift in a boat with enough supplies to reach land. This was good business practice. It encouraged future targets to surrender rather than fight. Crews that fought back might be treated more harshly. Some pirates had reputations for violence against resisting crews, torture to reveal hidden valuables, killings to make examples, general cruelty that served both as revenge and as warning to future targets. These decisions were made by vote, which meant that if the crew was angry or bloodthirsty, or just in a bad mood, the captured sailors could suffer for it. The treatment of captured sailors who agreed to join the pirate crew was another, voted decision. Some volunteers were welcomed immediately. Others were viewed with suspicion. Were they genuine, or were they just trying to survive and would turn on the pirates at the first opportunity? New recruits were often watched carefully, tested, and kept at arm's length until they proved their loyalty. Racial dynamics were complex on pirate ships. Free black sailors and escaped slaves served on many pirate crews, sometimes in positions of authority. This was not because pirates were particularly enlightened about race, they weren't, but because piracy attracted people from the margins of society, and competence mattered more than skin color when you were breaking the law together. That said, racial prejudice absolutely existed, and black crew members often faced discrimination and suspicion even in the relatively egalitarian pirate world. Women occasionally served on pirate ships, though they were rare. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are the most famous examples. Both fought as pirates on Calico Jack's crew. Both were skilled combatants, and both were eventually captured and tried. Their presence was unusual enough to be noteworthy, and they apparently had to fight to be accepted and respected by the male crew members. The pirate world was more open to women than legitimate maritime employment, but it was still heavily male-dominated and often hostile to women. The social dynamics of a pirate ship also involved constant negotiation about alcohol consumption, gambling, fighting, and other behaviors that could disrupt the crew. The articles usually included rules about these things, but enforcement was inconsistent. Too much drunkenness made the ship unsafe and inefficient, but too little leniency made the crew restless and unhappy. Finding the balance was an ongoing challenge. Morale was crucial and fragile. A successful prize boosted morale enormously, proof that the pirate life could pay off. Money in everyone's pocket, fresh supplies, if the captured ship had them. A long period without prizes, or a series of close calls with naval patrols, or too many men dying of disease. All of this eroded morale and could lead to crew members deserting, mutinying against the captain, or voting to end the cruise and return to port. The threat of mutiny was always present. If the captain lost the crew's confidence, whether through incompetence, cruelty, bad luck, or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, he could be removed. Sometimes this was a formal vote. Sometimes it was a knife in the back. The line between democratic accountability and violent overthrow was thin and easily crossed when men were armed, desperate, and angry. Your position in this social world was precarious. You had rights under the Articles, but those rights were only as strong as the crew's willingness to enforce them. You had a vote, but your voice was the weakest in the room. You were part of a democratic system, but democracy on a pirate ship was democracy with cutlasses and pistols, where the ultimate enforcement mechanism was violence. The meeting is breaking up. The vote has been taken. You voted with the majority because opposing them seemed unwise, given your status. The decision has been made. Tomorrow, you'll follow through on whatever the crew decided, because that's how pirate democracy works. Everyone votes, then everyone follows the decision or faces consequences. This is freedom, pirate style. It's not quite what you imagined, but it's what you signed up for, and it's what you're stuck with now. Chapter 8. The legal situation. Every government wants you dead. You're looking at a ship on the horizon, and it's flying Royal Navy colors. Your stomach drops. The crew is already preparing to run, trimming sails for maximum speed, checking that everything is secured for a potentially long chase. Because if that naval vessel catches you, your pirate career ends with a rope around your neck. Let's talk about the legal situation facing pirates, because it was comprehensively, thoroughly, definitively terrible. Every government in the Atlantic world, British, Spanish, French, Dutch, Portuguese, Wanted pirates caught and executed. There were no safe harbors, no friendly jurisdictions, no place where you could operate openly without fear of prosecution. Piracy was considered hostes humani generis, enemies of all mankind, under maritime law. This meant that any nation could prosecute pirates, regardless of where the piracy occurred or what flag the pirate ship flew. If you were caught, it didn't matter if you'd only attacked Spanish ships. The British would happily hang you anyway. This universal jurisdiction made piracy one of the few crimes where you were literally wanted everywhere. The penalties were severe and certain. Piracy was a capital crime. If you were captured and brought to trial, the verdict was almost always guilty, and the sentence was almost always death. The trial itself was often perfunctory. Evidence was usually overwhelming. You were captured on a pirate ship, possibly in the act of piracy, and there was no real legal defense available. Some pirate trials lasted less than a day. The execution method was hanging, specifically designed to be public and exemplary. Pirates were hanged at special locations: Execution Dock in London, Gallows Point in Port Royal, where large crowds could watch. The bodies were sometimes left hanging in gibbets as a warning to other potential pirates. In some cases, the bodies were coated in tar to preserve them and displayed for years as a deterrent. Some notable pirates had their bodies displayed at the entrance to harbors so that every ship entering port would see the remains as a reminder of what happened to pirates. Captain William Kidd's body was displayed in a gibbet on the Thames for over 20 years. This wasn't just punishment, it was public relations, sending a clear message about the consequences of piracy. The trial of Captain Bartholomew Roberts's crew in 1722 resulted in 52 men being hanged, the largest mass execution of pirates in history. The trials took place over weeks, but the outcomes were never in doubt. Some men pleaded for mercy based on having been forced into piracy, and a few were acquitted or transported rather than hanged, but the majority were executed. There were no pirate kingdoms, no pirate republics, despite what folklore sometimes suggests. The brief period when Nassau in the Bahamas was essentially a pirate port was ended when the British sent a naval force and a new governor who offered pardons to pirates who would quit and harsh justice to those who wouldn't. Many took the pardon. Those who didn't were hunted down. The pardon system was one of the few legal outs available. Occasionally, governments would offer general pardons to pirates who voluntarily surrendered, stopped pirating, and agreed to live lawfully. These pardons were politically motivated. It was expensive to hunt pirates, and offering pardons was a cheaper way to reduce piracy. But the pardons came with conditions, and breaking them meant being hunted as a pirate again. Some pirates took pardons, tried to go straight, and eventually went back to piracy because legitimate employment was so terrible, or because they couldn't adjust to legal life. Calico Jack Rackham took a pardon, briefly retired to Nassau, then stole a ship and went back to pirating. He was eventually captured and hanged, along with most of his crew, proving that pardons were only valuable if you actually stayed pardoned. The legal situation also meant that pirates couldn't spend their money easily. You couldn't walk into a port with a chest of Spanish gold coins and start spending freely without attracting attention and suspicion. Merchant ships kept records of their cargoes, and if unique or valuable items started appearing in the wrong hands, it could lead to investigations. Pirates had to fence their stolen goods through shady merchants, losing significant value in the process. Pirates also couldn't plan for the future in any normal sense. You couldn't save money in a bank. You couldn't invest in legitimate business. You couldn't return home to family unless you wanted to put them at risk of prosecution for harboring a criminal. Your entire existence was outside the legal economy and the legal society, which meant you lived day to day with no real prospects beyond the next prize. The psychological weight of being universally wanted was significant. You couldn't trust anyone outside your crew because turning in a pirate could earn a reward. Merchants, tavern keepers, prostitutes, other sailors. Anyone might report you to authorities if they suspected who you were, and thought they could profit from it. You lived in constant low-level paranoia, always aware that you were one recognition, one loose word, one bad interaction away from being arrested and hanged. Some pirates dealt with this pressure by embracing the outlaw identity completely, adopting dramatic personas, cultivating reputations for violence, essentially accepting that they were outside society and would never return. Blackbeard's theatrical persona, the burning fuses in his beard, the multiple pistols, the cultivated reputation for diabolical cruelty, was partially about intimidating opponents, but it was also about owning the outlaw identity, since he couldn't escape it anyway. Others tried to maintain some connection to legal life, saving money with the idea of eventually using a pardon or a false identity to retire. Most of these plans didn't work out because pirate careers tended to end in death or capture before retirement became an option. The legal situation also affected your interactions with authorities anywhere you went. Port officials, colonial governors, naval commanders, all of these people were, theoretically, your enemies and could arrest you on sight if they knew who you were. This limited where you could safely make port, how long you could stay, and how openly you could operate. Some corrupt officials could be bribed to look the other way, creating semi-safe harbors where pirates could resupply and rest if they paid the right people. But these arrangements were always precarious and could collapse if political winds changed or if a new, less corrupt official took over. The constant threat of naval pursuit shaped pirate tactics and strategy. You avoided naval vessels whenever possible, ran when you saw them, and only fought if cornered with no other option. Naval ships were better armed, better crewed, and better supplied than pirate vessels, and fighting them was usually a losing proposition. Even if you won the battle, you'd take casualties and damage that weakened you for future encounters. The expansion of naval anti-piracy patrols in the 1710s and 1720s was one of the main factors that ended the Golden Age of Piracy. More ships, better coordination, stronger political will to suppress piracy, and the reduction of corrupt safe harbors meant that pirate crews found it increasingly difficult to operate. The risks went up, while the rewards stayed the same, or decreased, and eventually the mathematics of piracy stopped making sense for most would-be pirates. Your legal status as a pirate meant you were, essentially, already dead. You were living on borrowed time between now and whenever you were caught or killed. The question wasn't if your pirate career would end badly, but when and whether you'd die in combat, from disease, or on the gallows. The sun is setting. That naval ship is still visible on the horizon, though your ship is faster and the gap is widening. You've escaped, this time, but the Royal Navy is out there, and they're looking for you, and they have more ships, more resources, and more time than you do. Every day as a pirate is a day closer to the end. That's the legal reality. That's what you signed up for when you took the articles. Welcome to Life is an Enemy of All Mankind. Hope you're comfortable with that status. Chapter 9. The Weather. Nature doesn't care about your adventure. You are on deck in what the experienced sailors are calling a bit of weather, which you are learning is sailor speak for a storm that could absolutely kill us all if we don't handle it correctly. The wind has gone from steady to violent. The sea has gone from rolling swells to actively hostile walls of water that crash over the bow and sweep the deck. The ship is heeling at angles that make standing difficult and walking dangerous, and everyone is working frantically to reduce sail before the wind tears the rigging apart. Welcome to Caribbean weather, which is going to teach you that the ocean is not your playground. It's not your romantic backdrop, and it absolutely does not care whether you survive or not. Let's talk about the weather challenges of pirate life, because the Caribbean and Atlantic waters where most Golden Age piracy occurred were not gentle environments. They were hurricane zones, storm tracks, areas of sudden squalls, and dangerous conditions that killed more sailors, pirate and legitimate alike, than combat ever did. Hurricane season in the Caribbean runs from June through November, with peak danger in August and September. Hurricanes in the 18th century were not the tracked, predicted, prepared for events they are today. There was no weather forecasting, no satellite imagery, no advance warning. You might notice the barometric pressure dropping if you had a barometer, or you might notice certain cloud formations or wind patterns if you were an experienced sailor. But often, a hurricane arrived with little warning, and if you were caught at sea when it hit, your survival was entirely dependent on your ship, your crew's skill and luck. A hurricane at sea in a small wooden ship was genuinely life-threatening. Winds that could reach 150 miles per hour, waves that could be 30 or 40 feet high, rain so heavy you couldn't see, conditions that made normal sailing impossible, and survival a minute-by-minute struggle. Ships were dismasted, their masts broken off by the wind or by the strain of trying to manage sails in those conditions. Ships were driven onto reefs or coasts and wrecked. Ships simply capsized and sank, taking everyone aboard down with them. The standard response to an approaching hurricane, if you had warning, was to find shelter, a protected harbor, an island's lee shore, anywhere that offered some protection from the open ocean. If you couldn't find shelter, you tried to put as much sea room as possible between yourself and any land, because being driven onto a coast in a hurricane was certain death. You struck most or all sail, secured everything that could move, and rode it out, hoping your ship's construction was sound enough to survive. During the hurricane, you couldn't do much except hold on and hope. The ship would be thrown around violently. Waves would break over the deck constantly. Everything below deck would be soaked. Men would be injured by being thrown against solid objects or swept overboard by waves. The noise, wind screaming through the rigging, waves crashing, wood groaning under stress, was overwhelming. The experience was genuinely terrifying. Hours or even days of sustained life-threatening conditions. Even if you survived the hurricane, the aftermath could be almost as dangerous. Damaged rigging needed repair before you could sail effectively. Leaks had to be found and patched. Injured men had to be treated. If you'd been blown off course, you needed to determine your position and navigate back to safe waters. And if your supplies had been damaged or lost, you had a food and water crisis on top of everything else. But hurricanes weren't the only dangerous weather. Squalls, sudden violent wind, and rainstorms could appear with minimal warning and cause serious problems. A squall hitting when you had full sail up could dismast you or capsize you if you didn't react quickly enough. The experienced sailors could read the signs of an approaching squall and prepare, but you, being new, wouldn't recognize those signs until it was too late. The heat of the Caribbean was another constant challenge. Temperatures regularly reached 90 or 95 degrees Fahrenheit, with high humidity that made it feel even hotter. You were working on a deck with no shade, except what the sails provided, wearing heavy clothing because that's what sailors wore. Canvas shirts and trousers that protected against sun and rope burns, but also trapped heat. Dehydration and heat exhaustion were constant risks. The sun exposure was brutal. Even sailors who were deeply tanned from years at sea could get sunburned on exposed skin. Your face, neck, hands, any skin that saw sun was at risk, and severe sunburn was genuinely incapacitating. Some sailors wore hats or improvised head coverings, but these weren't always available or practical depending on the work you were doing. The opposite problem appeared when sailing into northern waters or during winter months. Cold, wet conditions without proper shelter or warm clothing could lead to hypothermia. The damp, unheated ship became genuinely dangerous when temperatures dropped. Frostbite affected fingers and toes, limiting manual dexterity exactly when you needed it most for handling frozen rigging and sailing in difficult conditions. Fog was another hazard, particularly in certain waters and seasons. In fog, visibility dropped to near zero, making navigation dangerous and collision with other vessels, or land a real possibility. You couldn't see rocks, reefs, or coastlines until you were almost on top of them. Running aground in fog could wreck your ship, and there would be no warning beyond. The sound of waves breaking on obstacles you couldn't see, calms, periods of no wind, were less immediately dangerous than storms, but created their own crisis. A sailing ship with no wind was stuck in place, drifting with currents, but unable to make progress toward any destination. If a calm lasted for days or weeks, which was possible in certain latitudes and seasons, your food and water supplies would dwindle while you went nowhere. Men died of thirst during extended calms, watching their water ration drop day by day, while the ship sat motionless on a glassy, mocking sea. The doldrums, a belt of calm or erratic winds near the equator, were feared by all sailors for exactly this reason. Ships could be stuck for weeks, supplies running out, crew suffering from heat and dehydration, with no way to escape except waiting for wind that might or might not arrive in time. Lightning strikes were a constant danger, particularly in tropical squalls. A wooden ship with tall masts was essentially a lightning rod, and a direct strike could start fires, damage rigging, or kill crew members. There was no lightning protection system, no way to ground the strike safely. You just hoped it didn't hit, and if it did, you dealt with the consequences. Rough seas in general made every aspect of ship life harder and more dangerous. Cooking became nearly impossible when the ship was pitching violently. Sleep was difficult when you were being thrown around in your hammock. Moving around deck required holding on constantly to avoid being swept overboard or thrown into something solid. Work that was merely hard in calm conditions became genuinely dangerous in rough seas. The constant motion of the ship also affected your health in ways beyond seasickness. The human body isn't designed for perpetual motion in 3 dimensions. Over time, it affected your balance, your coordination, your spatial awareness. Sailors developed a distinctive rolling walk from adjusting to ship motion that made them awkward on land. Your inner ear adapted to constant movement, which meant that when you finally got to solid ground, you had to readjust to stillness, sometimes experiencing reverse seasickness, rogue waves, unexpectedly large waves that appeared seemingly from nowhere, could appear even in relatively calm conditions, and could be devastating. A rogue wave hitting broadside could capsize a ship or sweep crew members overboard. There was often no warning and no time to prepare, just sudden disaster and the desperate scramble to recover if recovery was even possible. The weather and sea state also affected your ability to hunt prizes. Merchant ships couldn't be chased effectively in heavy weather when sail handling was dangerous. Combat was nearly impossible when both ships were struggling just to stay afloat. This meant that bad weather didn't just endanger you directly, it also prevented you from earning money, extending the cruise and depleting supplies while providing no income to offset the costs. Navigation in bad weather was particularly challenging. Celestial navigation, using the sun or stars to determine position, required being able to see the sun or stars, which heavy weather prevented. Dead reckoning, calculating position based on speed and direction travel, became less accurate the longer you went without a celestial fix. Getting lost at sea was a real possibility, and being lost with dwindling supplies was potentially fatal. The psychological impact of extended bad weather was significant. Days or weeks of constant danger, poor conditions, inability to rest properly, and the knowledge that the weather could kill you at any moment created enormous stress. Crew morale deteriorated during extended bad weather, making everything else harder. The storm is passing now. The wind is dropping, the seas are calming, and the crew is assessing damage. The ship survived, you survived. Everyone is exhausted, and soaked and grateful to be alive. The sails need repair. The rigging needs adjustment. The bilge needs pumping because water came aboard and is sloshing around below deck. This is life at sea, at the mercy of weather systems you can't predict, can't control, and that will absolutely kill you if you're unlucky or unprepared. The ocean doesn't care about your dreams of adventure. It doesn't care whether you survive or not. It is a genuinely hostile environment that humans can navigate with skill and luck, but never with guaranteed safety. The romance of pirate life doesn't include the terror of storms, the misery of heat and sun exposure, the desperate fear of calms when water runs low, or the constant background awareness that the weather is one of many things trying to kill you. But it was all there, every day, every voyage, every moment at sea. Welcome to Caribbean Weather. Hope you're a good swimmer. You might need to be. Chapter 10. Why Pirates Quit. The ones who survived had reasons. You're sitting in a tavern in Nassau, and you are no longer a pirate. You took a pardon 6 months ago when the governor offered it, and you've been trying to live legitimately ever since. It's not going well. The wages for legitimate work are terrible. Employers don't trust you because of your past, and you're constantly tempted by the men still recruiting for pirate crews, knowing exactly what you're missing and what you're avoiding. Let's talk about why pirates quit, the ones who survived long enough to have that choice, because understanding the exit strategies shows you the full reality of pirate life from the perspective of people who actually lived it. The pardon system we mentioned earlier was the most common legitimate exit. Between 1718 and 1722, the British government offered several general pardons to pirates who would surrender, stop pirating, and swear to live lawfully. Hundreds of pirates took these pardons, including some famous names. These men had looked at their options and decided that a precarious, legitimate existence was better than continuing as pirates. Why would successful pirates quit? Several reasons. First, the risks were accumulating. Every cruise was a roll of the dice where you might be killed, captured, or seriously injured. The longer you pirated, the worse your odds became. Eventually, even the lucky ran out of luck, and some pirates recognized this and got out while they could. Second, the rewards were often disappointing. The treasure ship loaded with gold and jewels was rare. Most prizes yielded moderate returns, some trade goods, some money, supplies that were immediately useful but not particularly enriching. After the plunder was divided among the crew, after expenses were accounted for, individual shares were often modest. You risked your life repeatedly for returns that weren't actually making you wealthy. Third, the lifestyle was genuinely terrible. We've spent this entire script detailing why, but living it day after day wore men down. The hunger, the disease, the danger, the discomfort, all of it accumulated. Men who'd thought piracy would be an adventure discovered it was mostly misery with occasional moments of terror. Some decided that poverty on land was preferable to wealth at sea if wealth even materialized. The health consequences of pirate life also drove men to quit. Scurvy damage, recurring malaria, injuries that never fully healed, the cumulative effects of poor nutrition and hard labor. Men in their 30s who had been pirating for several years were often in terrible physical condition. Continuing was becoming physically impossible, and quitting before you were completely broken down made sense if you wanted any quality of life in your remaining years. Some pirates saved enough money to retire or thought they had. They took pardons, bought small properties or businesses, and attempted to live quietly on their gains. Some succeeded. Others found that their money didn't go as far as they'd hoped, or that they couldn't adjust to legitimate life, or that their past caught up with them in ways that made peaceful retirement impossible. The social isolation of pirate life also motivated some men to quit. Being permanently outside legitimate society, unable to return home, unable to form normal relationships, unable to plan for any future beyond the next voyage. This wore on people. Some men desperately wanted to reconnect with family, find wives, have children, live in communities rather than on ships. The pardon offered a path back to society, however precarious. The ones who quit successfully and stayed quit were usually the ones who had realistic expectations and practical plans. They didn't expect to be wealthy. They accepted that they'd need to work hard at legitimate employment that paid poorly. They moved to places where their past was less known and less likely to follow them. They kept their heads down, avoided former associates, and built new lives that were boring and safe and nothing like piracy. But many pirates who took pardons went back to piracy, some because legitimate life was so economically desperate that starvation seemed like a real possibility, some because they couldn't adjust to authority and structure after the relative freedom of pirate life, some because they developed a taste for the excitement and couldn't settle for the monotony of legal existence. some simply because they were better at piracy than at anything else and fell back on what they knew. Calico Jack Rackham, as mentioned earlier, took a pardon and went back to piracy. He was caught and hanged. This pattern repeated for many men who tried to quit, couldn't make it work, went back, and paid the ultimate price for it. The pardon system worked for some, but failed for many others, and failure meant execution. Some pirates never got the chance to quit on their own terms. They were killed in combat, died of disease, or were captured and executed before they could consider alternatives. The average pirate career was short, perhaps 2 to 5 years for most men who survived the initial period. Many didn't survive that long. The ones who lasted longer were either extraordinarily lucky, extraordinarily skilled, or operating in ways that reduced risk. And even they faced declining odds the longer they continued. The famous pirate captains who are remembered in history: Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, Charles Vane, Calico Jack, all died violently or were executed. None of them retired peacefully. This wasn't coincidence. It was the mathematics of the lifestyle catching up with them. The longer you pirated, the more enemies you made, the more attention you attracted, and the harder it became to escape. Some pirates tried creative exits, joining legitimate privateering ventures during wars, which allowed them to use their skills legally, settling in remote locations where they could live off their gains without much government oversight, purchasing fake identities and starting over in places where nobody knew their history. Some of these worked, many didn't. The pirate past had a way of catching up with people. The ones who successfully transitioned to legitimate life rarely talked about their pirate days. For obvious reasons, admitting to piracy was dangerous even after a pardon, and the social stigma was severe. This means our historical record is skewed toward the pirates who died or were captured rather than the ones who successfully quit and disappeared into normal life. What we can say is that the men who lived pirate life and survived it were often deeply scarred by the experience. Physically, injuries, disease damage, the effects of poor nutrition and hard labor. Psychologically, the trauma of violence, the stress of constant danger, the effects of living outside society. Many who quit probably carried those scars for the rest of their lives. The romantic notion of piracy assumes that the adventure is worth the risks, that the freedom is worth the danger, that the potential rewards justify the certain hardships. The men who actually lived it often concluded differently. When given the chance to quit, many took it, despite knowing that legitimate life would be hard and poor and constrained. That tells you something important about how bad pirate life actually was. You're still in that Nassau tavern. The drink in front of you is weak and expensive. The job you found pays barely enough to survive. You share a room with 3 other men in a boarding house that smells like mold and desperation. You are poor, constrained, living day to day with no security and little hope of improvement. And it's still better than being on that ship. That's the calculation you made. And most days, you think you made it correctly. Some days, when you hear the stories from the tavern recruiters, when you remember the brief moments of success and companionship, when the poverty of legitimate life becomes overwhelming, you wonder. But then you remember everything else: the hunger, the disease, the storms, the constant fear, the friends who died, the knowledge that you were on borrowed time. You made it out. You're one of the ones who survived. That alone makes you luckier than most who tried the pirate life. And you're not going back. Probably, hopefully. The choice is harder than it should be, and that tells you everything about what your alternatives were like. Conclusion: you're standing on a dock in the Caribbean, watching a ship head out to sea. It's flying no flag, a telltale sign, and you recognize some of the crew from your brief time among them. They're heading out on a cruise, looking for prizes, living the pirate life that you've just spent the last 20,000 words learning about in excruciating detail. You're not on that ship. And you're aware, with a clarity born from complete information, that this is a very good decision on your part. Let's review what we've learned about why you wouldn't last a day on a pirate ship. Not because you're weak or cowardly, but because pirate life was genuinely, comprehensively thoroughly terrible in ways that Hollywood has never bothered to show you. You learned that the recruitment happened because your legitimate options were so bad that criminality seemed like an improvement. That tells you everything about the economic conditions of the 18th century Atlantic world, where poverty was so grinding and exploitation so severe that men voluntarily chose to become wanted criminals. You learned that the ship itself was a cramped, damp, smelly prison that you couldn't leave, where privacy didn't exist, comfort was impossible, and you were perpetually in motion on an unstable platform. The romance of sailing evaporates pretty quickly when you're sleeping in a wet hammock inches from other men who smell as bad as you do. You learned that sailing was skilled, technical, physically brutal work that required years to master and that you were expected to perform immediately despite having no idea what you were doing. The rope work alone would have crippled your hands within days. The constant demands for coordinated action while the ship was moving would have exposed your incompetence in ways that endangered everyone. You learned that the food was barely adequate at best and actively harmful at worst. Hardtack with weevils, salt meat that barely qualified as meat, water that was going bad, and a diet so nutritionally deficient that your body would start falling apart from scurvy within weeks. Every meal was a reminder that you were living in deprivation. You learned that disease was the real killer. Scurvy, yellow fever, malaria, dysentery, tuberculosis, and a dozen other ailments for which there was no effective treatment, and from which many pirates died. The medicine available was worse than useless, and survival was more about luck than anything else. You learned that combat was brief, brutal, terrifying chaos that bore no resemblance to movie sword fights, and that the trauma of violence affected even successful pirates. The weapons were crude, the tactics were desperate, and your lack of experience would have made you a liability and a victim. You learned that pirate democracy was real, but came with violence and instability. You had a vote, but you also had the constant threat of duels, mutiny, and social hierarchies based on competence you didn't possess. Freedom from traditional authority came with submission to mob rule backed by weapons. You learned that you were wanted everywhere by every government, that capture meant certain execution, and that you were living on borrowed time with no realistic prospect of a good ending. The legal situation wasn't just bad, it was hopeless. Every day as a pirate was a day closer to the gallows. You learned that the weather was another enemy, as dangerous as combat and more unpredictable. Hurricanes, storms, heat, cold, calms, all of them could kill you, and you had no real defense except the skill of your crew and luck. And you learned that the pirates who survived long enough to have a choice often chose to quit, accepting poverty and legitimacy over the continuing horrors of pirate life. That tells you more about the reality of piracy than any of the romantic myths ever could. Here's what pirate life actually was. It was hunger and disease and danger and discomfort, day after day, week after week, month after month. It was skilled work performed under terrible conditions for uncertain rewards. It was social isolation, legal persecution, constant violence, and the knowledge that your life could end at any moment from any of 100 different causes. The freedom that piracy offered was freedom from one type of exploitation in exchange for exposure to a dozen other types of suffering. The camaraderie was real. The democratic elements were genuine, and some men did find a kind of meaning in the pirate life. But the cost was enormous, and most men who tried it paid that cost with their lives, their health, or their futures. Modern people romanticize piracy because we focus on the moments of action and ignore the months of misery between them. We see the dramatic battles and miss the slow death from scurvy. We see the democratic councils and miss the violence that enforced them. We see the treasure and miss the starvation when prizes were scarce. We see the freedom and miss the fact that you were trapped on a ship in an ocean that wanted to kill you, while every government hunted you for execution. Your ancestors who became pirates weren't fools, and they weren't different from you in terms of capabilities or character. They were desperate people in desperate times, choosing between terrible options doing what they thought gave them the best chance at survival or success. Some were criminals who deserved punishment. Others were victims of economic systems that offered them no legitimate path to security. Most were probably somewhere in between, ordinary people making bad choices under pressure. But understanding why they made those choices doesn't mean romanticizing the reality they faced. Pirate life was brutal and short. The ones who survived often bore physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The ones who didn't survive, which was most of them, died in ways that were lonely, painful, and meaningless, despite whatever rebellious symbolism we might want to project onto them. You wouldn't have lasted a day on a pirate ship, not because of any personal failing, but because you haven't spent your entire life building the skills, knowledge, and psychological hardness that pirate life required. You don't know how to sail. You can't navigate by stars. You haven't developed immunity to tropical diseases. You've never learned to function on inadequate nutrition and broken sleep. You've never had to hurt someone in close combat. You've never lived with the knowledge that you're wanted dead and that capture means execution. And here's the thing, you don't want to learn those things. The cost of learning them is too high, paid in suffering and trauma, and years taken off your life. The modern world, for all its problems, has solved the fundamental issues that made piracy seem like a rational choice. We have labor laws, minimum wages, social safety nets, economic mobility, and rule of law. These things are imperfect and unequally distributed, but they exist, and they mean that crime doesn't look attractive compared to the alternatives the way it did in 1720. So the next time you watch a pirate movie and think, that looks fun, remember everything you've learned here. Remember the weevils in the hardtack, the scurvy eating away at your gums, the storms that could capsize your ship, the diseases that would kill half your crew, the constant exhausting labor, the violence and fear, and the gallows waiting at the end. Then appreciate your boring, safe, comfortable modern existence. Appreciate that you can eat fresh food without parasites. Appreciate that you can see a doctor who will actually help you instead of bleed you. Appreciate that you're not wanted for execution by every government in the world. Appreciate that your workplace doesn't involve climbing rain-slicked rigging 40 feet above a rolling deck in a storm. Pirate life was not an adventure. It was not freedom. It was not romantic. It was a desperate, dangerous, and usually brief existence that most people didn't survive, and that those who did often regretted. The ship is disappearing over the horizon now. You watch it go, and then you turn and walk back into town, toward whatever legitimate work you can find, whatever constrained and limited life awaits you. It's not freedom. It's not adventure. It's just survival in the most basic sense, and it's so much better than the alternative. The pirate life is sailing away into the sunset, and you are enormously grateful not to be on board. Hope you enjoyed the tour. Now go appreciate your comfortable chair, your fresh water, and your extremely low risk of being hanged. You've earned that appreciation. The end? Conclusion: the legacy of medieval imprisonment. So here we are at the end of our journey through the absolute nightmare that was medieval imprisonment. We've explored the dungeons, the torture, the disease, the injustice, and the cruelty that define this system. Let's take a moment to reflect on what all of this means and why it matters to understand this history. Medieval prisons were fundamentally different from modern prisons in their purpose and design. Modern prisons, whatever their flaws, are theoretically designed for punishment, deterrence, and sometimes rehabilitation. Medieval prisons weren't about any of those things. They were about holding people until trial, about extracting confessions through torture, and about demonstrating the absolute power of authority over individual lives. The conditions we've described weren't aberrations or failures of the system. They were the system working exactly as designed. The cruelty was intentional. The suffering was policy. The deaths were acceptable. This tells us something important about medieval society. It was a world where human life, at least the lives of common people, had very little value. You were expendable, replaceable, unimportant. The complete lack of rights is staggering from a modern perspective. no due process, no speedy trial, no protection from cruel punishment, no legal representation. None of the protections we take for granted existed. The torture was perhaps most shocking. The idea that causing extreme pain to force confessions was not only legal, but encouraged and systematized shows how different. Medieval justice was from our ideals today. We like to think humans have always valued truth and justice, but medieval courts valued confession and social control. Truth was secondary to maintaining order and authority. The disease and death rates in medieval prisons were astronomical. More prisoners died from illness and neglect than from execution. The prisons themselves were death sentences. This wasn't hidden or denied. Everyone knew prisons were deadly, but there was no movement for reform, no public outcry, no sense that this was wrong. It was just accepted. The guards and jailers who ran these systems weren't considered monsters by their society. They were doing their jobs, maintaining order, serving authority. The systemic nature of the cruelty is important to understand. Individual sadists existed, certainly, but the real horror is that ordinary people could administer this system without seeing anything wrong with it. The banality of evil in medieval imprisonment. Women, children, the poor, minorities, all suffered additional layers of abuse. The medieval prison system reflected and amplified all the inequalities and prejudices of medieval society. The few who escaped or survived did so through extraordinary luck, resources, or resilience. They were exceptions, proving how terrible the rule was. Life after release was damaged and difficult. The system didn't just imprison bodies, it destroyed lives, families, and futures. Why does this history matter? Why spend 20,000 words exploring medieval prison horrors? First, it gives us perspective. When we complain about modern problems with criminal justice, and there are real problems, we should remember how much worse things once were. This isn't to dismiss modern issues, but it's to recognize progress. We've come an incredibly long way from medieval dungeons to modern prisons with regulations, oversight, and rights. Second, it reminds us that rights and protections aren't natural or inevitable. They were fought for, developed over centuries, and can be lost if we're not vigilant. The right to a fair trial, protection from torture, humane treatment, all of these are recent developments historically. Medieval people had none of them, and we shouldn't take them for granted. Third, it shows us what happens when authority is unchecked and human dignity is disregarded. Medieval prisons were what you get when power is absolute and empathy is absent. This is relevant today. Wherever authority operates without oversight, wherever prisoners have no rights or protections, echoes of medieval prisons persist. Fourth, it honors the memory of those who suffered. Thousands upon thousands of people died in medieval prisons. Most were never recorded. Their names, their stories, their lives are lost. By understanding what they endured, we give them a kind of memorial. We acknowledge that their suffering happened and mattered, even if their society didn't care. The medieval prison system eventually evolved into something less horrific. Changes came gradually, reforms here, new laws there, shifting attitudes about justice and human dignity. By the early modern period, some improvements appeared, but real change took centuries and came from sustained effort by reformers who believed people deserved better. We're still evolving. Modern prison systems have serious problems: overcrowding, violence, inadequate medical care, racial disparities. The work of creating truly just and humane systems continues, but the distance from medieval dungeons to today is vast. We've recognized rights, established protections, created oversight mechanisms. Imperfect as our systems are, they're incomparably better than what medieval prisoners endured. Understanding medieval prisons helps us appreciate this progress while recognizing we can do better still. It's both a measure of how far we've come and a reminder that improvement is possible. Looking at specific reforms over the centuries shows how change happened. The gradual abolition of torture, the development of habeas corpus, the establishment of rights for the accused. These didn't happen overnight. Reformers faced enormous resistance. Those in power benefited from the medieval system. Change came through persistent effort by people who believed in human dignity despite societal indifference. John Howard's prison reforms in the 18th century, inspired by visiting European prisons, marked a turning point. His documentation of prison conditions shocked people into demanding change. Cesare Beccaria's writings on crime and punishment challenged medieval assumptions about justice. His arguments against torture and for proportional punishment influenced legal reforms across Europe. These reformers and others like them gradually shifted public opinion. What had been accepted as normal, torture, indefinite detention, execution for minor crimes, became seen as barbaric. The story of medieval imprisonment is ultimately about human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. The cruelty of the system, the resilience of those who survived it. It's also about the power of ideas to change society. Medieval imprisonment seemed eternal and unchangeable to those living under it, but ideas about rights, dignity, and justice eventually transformed the system. This gives us hope. Current injustices that seem intractable can change. Systems that seem permanent can be reformed or replaced. History shows this is possible. But it also warns us. Medieval prisons didn't disappear because authorities became nicer. They changed because people fought for change, documented abuses, and refused to accept the status quo. Wherever prisoners today lack rights or face abuse, the medieval model persists, fighting for prisoner rights, advocating for justice reform, demanding accountability. These continue the work medieval reformers began. It's about what happens when society values order over justice, control over rights, and power over human dignity. It's a cautionary tale about what we must avoid becoming again. The medieval prison experience teaches us that civilization is fragile. The protections we enjoy were built slowly and can be dismantled quickly if we're not vigilant. Countries that backslide into authoritarian rule often see prison conditions deteriorate rapidly. Secret prisons, torture, disappearances. These medieval practices return when oversight fails. International human rights law exists partly because of historical memory of places like medieval prisons. Never again should people be held without trial, tortured for confessions, or denied basic dignity. But enforcing these standards requires constant effort. Simply having laws isn't enough. They must be implemented, monitored, and defended against those who'd prefer medieval methods. What modern people don't understand about medieval imprisonment. Here's what you need to understand about why you specifically, as a modern person, wouldn't last even a single day in a medieval prison. Not because you're weak, but because nothing in your life has prepared you for what that experience actually entailed. You've never experienced true helplessness. Modern life, even at its worst, offers options. You can call someone, you can leave, you can file complaints, you can seek help. In a medieval prison, none of those options existed. You were utterly powerless, completely at the mercy of people who had none, and that psychological reality would break you faster than the physical conditions. You've never experienced genuine darkness. Your eyes have never adjusted to complete, absolute absence of light because you've never been in complete darkness for more than a few minutes. In a medieval dungeon, that darkness would last for days, weeks, months. Your mind would start playing tricks. You'd hallucinate. You'd lose your sense of time and space. The darkness alone would drive you toward madness. You've never experienced real cold. Central heating, warm clothing, hot showers. These have been your baseline for your entire life. The bone-deep, inescapable cold of a medieval dungeon where your wet clothes never dried and stone walls leached every bit of warmth from your body would be agonizing in ways you can't imagine. Hypothermia would set in within hours. You've never experienced complete isolation. Even in solitary moments, you've had phones, books, screens, the knowledge that you could connect with someone if you wanted. Complete isolation. No voices, no faces, no human contact for days or weeks would destroy your mental health rapidly. Humans aren't built for that level of isolation. You've never experienced real hunger. Missing a meal makes you uncomfortable. Going a day without food makes you genuinely hungry. But the starvation of medieval imprisonment, weeks with minimal food, your body consuming itself, your mind obsessing over food constantly. That's a level of suffering you've never approached. You've never experienced complete absence of medical care. You take for granted that if you're injured or sick, help exists. In a medieval prison, there was no help. An infected cut would kill you. A broken bone would heal wrong, or not at all. Disease would run its course with no intervention. The knowledge that no help was coming would be terrifying. You've never experienced genuine torture. Physical pain in your life has been temporary and treatable. The systematic, prolonged torture used in medieval prisons, designed to cause maximum suffering while keeping you alive, would break your mind and body in ways that television and movies can't convey. You'd confess to anything, betray anyone, do whatever was demanded, just to make it stop. You've never lived without hope. Even in your darkest moments, you've had hope that things would improve, that the situation was temporary, that help might arrive. In a medieval prison, hope died quickly. Most prisoners who entered never left alive. Knowing this, accepting this, continuing to exist anyway, that's a psychological burden you've never carried. The modern world has cushioned you from experiences that were routine for medieval prisoners. This isn't a criticism. It's the entire point of civilization. We've built systems specifically to prevent the conditions that medieval prisons created, but it means you're unprepared for those conditions in ways that go beyond just lacking practical skills. Your immune system is different. You've been vaccinated. You've had antibiotics when needed. You've lived in sanitary conditions. Exposure to the disease environment of a medieval prison would overwhelm your immune system immediately. You'd be sick within days, seriously ill within weeks. Your nutritional needs are different. Your body is accustomed to regular, adequate nutrition. The sudden shift to starvation rations would shock your system. You'd lose weight rapidly, lose muscle mass, become weak and unable to function. Your body wouldn't know how to conserve resources the way medieval bodies learned to do. Your psychological resilience is different. Not worse, just different. You've been raised with expectations of rights, justice, fairness, and human dignity. Having all of those violated simultaneously would be more psychologically devastating to you than to someone who'd never had those expectations in the first place. Your tolerance for discomfort is different. You've never had to ignore constant, severe physical discomfort for extended periods. Pain signals that you'd normally respond to, hunger, cold, exhaustion, would be screaming at you constantly with no relief available. Learning to function despite them would take time you wouldn't have. So when we say you wouldn't last a day in a medieval prison, we're not exaggerating. Within 24 hours, you'd be hypothermic, dehydrated, psychologically shattered, and already developing the infections that would eventually kill you if you somehow survived longer. Your modern advantages, education, knowledge, skills, would be completely useless. Your disadvantages, soft body, unprepared mind, zero relevant experience, would be fatal. The final lesson. So what's the point of spending this much time understanding something so horrible that no longer exists? Why dive this deeply into the darkness of medieval imprisonment? Because forgetting this history means risking its return. Because appreciating how far we've come helps us defend against backsliding. Because understanding what humans did to other humans reminds us what we're capable of when we abandon principles of dignity and rights. Medieval prisons weren't aberrations. They were the logical result of societies that didn't value human rights, that accepted torture as legitimate, that saw prisoners as less than human. They existed because people allowed them to exist, because authorities benefited from them, because alternatives seemed impossible or unnecessary. They ended because people fought to end them, because reformers documented abuses, challenged assumptions, demanded better, because slowly, painfully, society developed the idea that humans have inherent dignity that must be respected even when, especially when, they're powerless. That idea isn't natural or inevitable. It's a hard-won achievement that must be defended in every generation. Wherever you see prisoners denied rights, subjected to torture, held without trial, kept in inhumane conditions, you're seeing echoes of medieval prisons. and you have a choice about whether to accept it or oppose it. The medieval prison system was comprehensively, systematically evil, not in the sense of supernatural malevolence, but in the sense of humans deliberately creating conditions that destroyed other humans for purposes of control, punishment, and profit. It worked. It achieved its goals. And it caused immeasurable suffering to countless thousands of people whose names we'll never know. You wouldn't have lasted a day in a medieval prison. Neither would I. Neither would almost anyone alive today. We're not built for it because civilization has evolved beyond requiring that kind of hardness. That's progress. That's achievement. That's something to protect and extend. So the next time you complain about modern problems with criminal justice, and there are real, serious problems that deserve criticism, remember medieval dungeons, remember torture chambers, and oubliettes, and prisoners dying of starvation and darkness. Remember that the distance from there to here represents centuries of struggle for human rights and dignity. Then use that perspective to push for further improvement, because we're not done, because prisoners today still suffer injustices, because the work of creating truly humane justice systems continues, because remembering medieval prisons should inspire us not to complacency, but to vigilance. The dungeons are empty now. The torture chambers are museums. The oubliettes are tourist attractions. The system that created them is gone, but the capacity to create similar horrors remains, buried in human nature and social structures, waiting for the moment when we forget why we built protections against it. Don't forget. Remember medieval prisons. Remember what happens when authority goes unchecked, when human dignity is denied, when cruelty becomes policy. Remember, so that it never happens again. You wouldn't last a day in a medieval prison. Be grateful for that fact. Then make sure nobody else ever has to try. Welcome to the end of our tour through one of humanity's darkest creations. You've learned more than you wanted to know about medieval imprisonment. You've understood why it was worse than you imagined. You've appreciated how far civilization has come. Now go forward with that knowledge. Use it to recognize injustice when you see it. Use it to defend human rights when they're threatened. Use it to appreciate the protections you have while working to extend them to others. The medieval prison experience was real. The suffering was real. The people who endured it were real, and they deserve to be remembered. Their experience teaches us what must never be allowed again. This has been Why You Wouldn't Last a Day in Prison in the Middle Ages. Now you know. And knowing this, you understand why the evolution from medieval dungeons to modern justice systems, imperfect as they are, represents one of humanity's great achievements. Stay free, stay grateful, stay vigilant, because rights are never permanently secured. They must be defended in every generation against those who'd return us to medieval methods. Remember that every right you enjoy was won by someone who suffered without it. Honor their struggle by protecting those rights and extending them to all. This has been Sleepless Historian. Thanks for watching.